Alright, so this video is going to be on understanding projective identification better. So to start off on projective identification, let me give you the technical definition. And the technical definition is the patient projects internal objects and gets the person on whom they're projecting to behave like those objects, as if that target person had those same introjects. And I remember when I first learned about projective identification, it almost seemed like it was magical or supernatural. But I think when you have a better grasp on what's actually going on, it seems less mystical, and that gives you the opportunity to spot it and see it more often. And don't get nervous yet. I'm going to make sure that by the end of this video, you're going to read that sentence and actually have a clue as to what that means. So a quick disclaimer, projective identification is not as magical as it first sounds. And I want to make sure it's known that this is a real phenomenon that does actually occur. Some theorists consider it to be a central feature in human relations, and they consider it to be a huge part of the therapeutic interaction. Other people think it's just a small fraction of human behavior. I personally have seen it occur in an overt fashion with patients and even some colleagues. But I also believe that it occurs in subtler forms and even in non-pathological ways. So let me repeat that same definition, but a bit slower this time. So the first part is the person views the other in a distorted way, and that way is determined by the patient's past. And that's the projection part of the projective identification. And the second part that makes it projective identification, not projection, is that pressure is exerted on the other person to experience themselves in the same way that the person's unconscious fantasy is occurring. And that's the identification part. But again, I'll make it so it's much clearer throughout the video. But first, we have another edition of spooky definitions. And this is where I define these things in ways that makes them more readable, and I sacrifice maybe some technical accuracy for the ability to understand what these words mean. So objects just is a fancy way of saying representations of people. Projection is when you confuse what's going on inside for things that are going on the outside. Introjection is the opposite, so it's confusing what's going on the outside for what's occurring internally. Identification is just imitating behavior of another person. And projective identification is when the projector views the projectee in a distorted way and then puts pressure on the projectee to experience themselves in that way. And I'll just have this here so you can always scroll back to see what these words mean in a simplified manner. But let me just do a quick overview now as to why this occurs. So in childhood, we internalize, or more specifically introject relationships. So as an example, when our parents love us, we internalize that someone is loving us and that our self is being loved. And the point is that the dynamic is internalized. The arrow points both ways, both from the internalization of the child to the parent and the internalization of the parent to the child. Of course, there are other dynamics that we can internalize. For example, critical other and criticized self, or maybe it's rejecting other and rejected self, or abusive other and abused self. And then these dynamics become a template in our psyche that inform who we are and the expectations we have for interactions. So as you get older, you reenact the dynamics by embodying the internalized other and then projecting onto others the perception of the self. So as an example, when you were a child, you were criticized, so you internalized that dynamic, and now you recreate it by criticizing the other person and making them feel as you did as a child. And you may be wondering, why would we do something like that? And there's a whole host of reasons. The first is that it's comfortable. It confirms our views on how relationship works. And even if that relationship is based on abuse, it shows that we're getting our needs met. And when we're stressed, our psyche will turn to something that comforts it. And one way to comfort it is to recreate the past. And another reason is that it's an internal conflict that our psyche is trying to work out. So it's trying to recreate a corrective experience in the belief that this time we'll get it right. Another reason is that maybe it's a fantasy that if we recreate something externally, then it doesn't exist internally. So the internal conflict exists externally, then it satisfies the ego because then it's something outside and not something that's inside. But let's move on to the fun part now and get to a better visual of what actually occurs with projective identification. So I'm going to demonstrate projective identification with our friends Shia and Leo. And here, Shia is going to be the one who's projectively identifying, and Leo is going to be the poor, unsuspecting victim. So in this scenario, Shia and Leo are friends, and they're hanging out, and Leo's being his comforting, normal, cool self. You can see on Shia's face that something's up. So first, step one is the person externalizes or projects the all bad aggressive self and object image. So in this scenario, we can see that Shia is going to project onto Leo aspects of his aggressive images. So Shia experiences Leo as aggressive when in reality Shia is just projecting his aggressive self and other images. Now here's the part that in my opinion most people miss, and it's why projective identification isn't as magical as it first seems. So the second part is that the projection of the aggression is not completely clean. So Shia still identifies with the aggression that's being projected. So the identification part in projective identification aggression is referring to the fact that Leo is going to experience himself as aggressive. But I actually remember how projective identification works by thinking of it as step 1 and step 2 of what Shia does. So there's the word projective identification. So step 1 is the projection and step 2 is the identification. So step 1 is projection, projective identification. So he projects the aggression. And then step 2, projective identification, is identification. So step 2 is that the projection isn't clean and he identifies with the aggression as well. So Shia acting aggressive is what brings about step 3, and that's controlling the other person. So Shia then acts in a manner that attempts to control Leo in order to make Leo feel as if he is being aggressive. So I think of it as the aggression that he's still feeling is causing him to act in such a way that eventually is going to get to Leo. So Shia is going to keep acting in an escalating manner in order to induce in Leo the dynamic that he wants. So Shia starts acting in this aggressive manner, and maybe at first Leo's a little confused. He's thinking to himself, what's going on? But eventually Shia is going to do something that induces in Leo such an aggression that he has to act aggressive. So eventually Shia is going to do something that makes Leo snap, and Leo's going to act aggressively. So the projective identification is complete. So to summarize, at first Shia projected the aggression onto Leo. Then second, he still held on to some of the aggression, so he acted in an aggressive manner to Leo. And third, Shia eventually induced in Leo the aggressive dynamics that Shia believed were going on. And when this occurs in such an overt manner, what the person projecting will do is they'll disown the aspects of themselves that they view as negative. So Shia will only really remember the end dynamic that occurred, and he'll forget kind of his role in inducing it. And again, just to emphasize, the identification part historically is referring to the fact that Leo is identifying or introjecting Shia's dynamics. But I personally use it to remember the fact that Shia still holds on to whatever the part he's projecting, and that makes it seem to me less magical as to why the inducing of Leo's behavior occurs. So let's quickly summarize everything. So projective identification is projecting an impulse, then continuing to experience the impulse, as well as the fear of that impulse while the projection is active. So the need to control the external object. So projective identification can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the person believing something false about another person then will influence or coerce them into carrying out that exact projection. And if you've ever been a victim of projective identification, it's a weird feeling. At first, it's very confusing and disorienting, and then eventually you take on some of the characteristics, and it feels as if they're yours. And I feel like that annoying term gaslighting is kind of getting thrown around all the time now. And that's when, in extreme cases, the recipient loses sense of their real identity and kind of becomes reduced to this passive carrier of outside projections as if they're possessed by them. But to end on a good note, projective identification operates in everyday life. It's not necessarily psychopathology. People can project and identify with loving and joyful affects, and a contagion of good feeling can occur. It kind of reminds me, if you've ever been to a festival, of that weird sense of community and happiness that you feel when you're at the festival. I think what's occurring is that people are projecting and identifying with joyful affects. So projective identification is most associated with people who are borderline, but it's not exclusively used by people who are borderline. There are a bunch of little and benign ways that people projectively identify every day, and it's not necessarily psychopathology. And even when what is being projected is negative, it's not necessarily unduly harmful if it's not relentless.